Hello and welcome to another week of the PolitiBabble podcast, where this time we do actually have a guest for once. I'm Archibald Elliott, and as usual, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host,
Oliver Sykes.
And
Mika Chen.
So yes, we're back for another week, but this time to talk about, is the minimum wage
Flawed.
That was it.
Yeah.
I couldn't see the question anywhere on our agenda doc. But first, as we always do with the guests, we do have to ask you a question, and I'm not sure if we've pre-warned you of this one. But, you know, we're going full journalistic spirit here and not warning you of it. If you were a cake, Mika, what cake would you be?
Well, you definitely didn't preempt this one, did you, Ollie?
No. Should I've not been good on my briefs recently.
If I was a cake, what cake would I be? Just any cake.
Yeah, any cake.
So my best friend Denny, who actually sits in front of Ollie in politics,
Yeah.
her dad is a chef, and every year for her birthday he makes this 2-tiered Oreo chocolate cake, homemade, and every year we all count down to her birthday just to have this cake. So I'm gonna say that I'd be Denny's dad's Oreo cake.
Very good, very good. We like the.
Yes.
I'm a fan of Oreo. They are vegan as well, Oreos.
Are they? Didn't they?
Are they vegan?
Yeah,
Really?
they're vegan.
Yeah.
Vegan sausage roll.
Yes. I had no idea.
Yes. So, but obviously the cake might not be vegan, but very interesting. Yes. So, welcome to the podcast, Mika. It's very good, great to have you here. We are kicking off 2022 with our first ever guest. Mika is a student at one of the Ireland's high schools, and you do politics and economics.
Yeah,
isn't
I
it?
do.
Yes.
Yeah.
So fairly knowledgeable on what we're talking about today, and you have quite a good interest in
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
in this topic. So, what are your thoughts on the minimum wage? To start off with, do you believe it's? I think that's where we'll start with. Is your thoughts on it initially, and we'll come back to it towards the end.
I think I see both sides to it. There's a lot of pros and a lot of cons to the minimum wage, and it's not really, from an economics perspective, it's really not a black and white thing where you can kind of preempt what consequences an increase or decrease in the minimum wage will have. So it's a really difficult one to pin down, because it's not a case of what you believe in terms of on your political orientation. It's more so different circumstances can have completely different effects when it comes to minimum wage.
I mean, here on the islands, they're hoping to increase the minimum wages in April. I mean, they're still undecided on it. It's proposed, I'm pretty sure. And looking at it earlier, I mean, for someone of our age, it looks quite good, really, for especially young people. I mean, but this is probably to conform with the inflation that we're currently experiencing.
But is it necessarily good? Because if we're looking at it, most of the young people employed are employed by small to medium-sized businesses, probably, along the spectrum. And those are more likely to think, well, I'm now going to have to pay the youth, if the youth is, for example, raised in line with the adult wage. We now would have to pay the youth the same as an adult worker, when the adult worker could have more experiences. And again, do we want to employ so many youth? Is it going to harm possibly youth employment? Because they cost more to employ for a job that, do we need so many?
That's a good point, and that's one of the many kind of economic perspectives on this, is that it does create mass unemployment. Neoclassical economists tend to believe this a bit more so, but it's a tricky one, because if you think about it, like you said, to adjust the wages for inflation, for example, seems like a good idea in the short run. So if you're talking about short run aggregate supply and you're talking about short run economic growth, it would seem like the best thing to do is to increase it. So obviously nominal wages increase, so they're adjusted for inflation, and as the prices rise, so do wages. But many people would argue that by increasing minimum wage, you actually increase the price level. So it's kind of like, where do you draw the point? Where do you draw the line? Where's the point where you say that's enough of an increase? We kind of have to take a long run stance on this and wait for the inflation rates to come down a bit to match the minimum wage, because the more you increase the minimum wage, the more the price level is going to go up, and the more the equilibrium price of the aggregate market is, the macroeconomy is going to go up. So it's a hit and miss, really.
I don't think anyone can really argue with that point. But in terms of sort of the Isle of Man, I like to put it in perspective here because
Oliver loves to go for small scale.
yeah, of course I do. It's
good to bring it home.
It's it's where we are, and we can, yeah.
Are we
anyway.
really here though? I'll pose that philosophical question in another debate.
Yes,
Yeah.
it may be a philosophical podcast, perhaps.
Maybe next week's episode.
But in terms of sort of people on the poverty line, the minimum wage increase is, it's sort of something that they are looking for, something that they want, to bring them above sort of the poverty that they might be experiencing.
But will it bring them above the poverty? As Mika said, if you look at inflation rising, inflation has contributions from minimum wage. We see, I think the chief of the Bank of England, the head of the Bank of England, he was speaking about maybe those at the top earners not maybe asking for such large pay rises above inflation and with inflation levels, because it will just drive again the price of goods up because people need to afford more. It's almost that won't help bring inflation under control. I don't know if that's the best measure. The measure which we have currently is because we're seeing energy prices rise, not necessarily. Again, it's a form of inflation, but it is rising because we have crises abroad. If we're looking at it, maybe the government could be better suited. Again, not something I would necessarily call for, to do what Rishi Sunak is doing, is providing economic support to kind of keep the wages at the same rate they are, so not put extra pressure on businesses, but provide support where it's needed.
It's a good point, that, but it also does depend on kind of your economic perspective. So kind of in terms of Keynesian economics, they believe that obviously in sticky prices, so the inflation won't go down. It depends if you believe in the price mechanism essentially, and if you're kind of more aligned with Adam Smith in your views or not, because it's like,
I'm not a fan of Keith.
do you think that the price mechanism is going to bring them down regardless, or some economists believe that government intervention is needed to bring the price levels down and to restore the market to its equilibrium price? It depends honestly what you believe, but as well, if you kind of abolish the minimum wage, I think in America it was only introduced in 1933 by Roosevelt, and since then there have been various increases. I think Obama tried to increase it, but it didn't get through the Senate. Trump didn't increase it in his terms, but it has increased in America over the years, and you still see there is a mass increase in the poverty percentage in terms of the American people as well.
But people don't necessarily. Some do, but on the whole, lots of entry-level jobs use the minimum wage, get people in to give them experience, and then they move relatively quickly in the majority into jobs which pay above the minimum wage, and depending on what sector we go into. But I do think, going back to your point about the market, I think the market will control. Honestly, it's price and the wage it pays for labour. With government control, the government's very much saying this is the price we're putting on labour, and it is never going to go down. We're always going to see this increase in inflation. We're never going to see getting rid of inflation. We're always seeing going to costs. We see this in the media. Oh, costs rising by however much. Oh, this rising by however much. It's always going to rise because the government's saying we're going to put it in here, and it will rise the minimum wage because people want to propose it to living wage. But as the living wage goes up, as the minimum wage goes up, the living wage goes up because everything gets more expensive because of inflation.
Yeah.
So we're never going to really get rid of this problem. And companies, if they can put, again, if the worker will work for them, they need to put a competitive wage out to the market. Ford did something quite interesting, I think, going back to very early on in America. He paid double the market rate for his workers. He paid double the market rate, and I think that has some benefits because if the company itself wants to attract the best worker to provide the best products, to then provide almost the best output and best service, they want to attract that best person working. So they'll pay the top dollar for it. So I think this idea that the government needs to mandate a minimum wage is almost anti this idea of business, because business would then just pay, well, the business which would pay the least would still pay the least, and the government businesses which would pay double would still pay double. So I think it doesn't really benefit us in the long run. And again, companies, If Ford wants to go and increases output, increases very good products, then his rival of like General Motors might want to do the same, and they want to increase their products, increase their capability and production line and their standards. So then they'll almost compete, and yes, there'll be an equilibrium reached where eventually they won't want to spend any more because they're not going to say I'm paying. It's not going to turn into a bidding war. They'll say I pay $2, I'll pay $3, I'll pay $4, I'll pay $5, because there'll be a cap reached obviously where the product will be outrun by its cost to produce.
I mean, going back on an earlier point about sort of the abolishing the minimum wage, I mean, surely that would see sort of the exploitation of workers, and surely big corporations. I mean, a lot of big corporations pay reasonably well. I mean, over here we see the likes of McDonald's, Boots, M&S. They pay reasonably well, and for people of our age, they get paid exceptionally well. Nowhere near the minimum wage at all. They're several pounds higher than that.
Yeah, see, but you say that, but albeit the government are proposing to increase the minimum wage, inflation on the Isle of Man this year is what figure? I think it's something like
it's currently just sitting at about just under 6%.
It's
It depends which index.
Yeah, of course. But the average.
Yes. But it's ridiculously high, and if you think about people will always want they will never stand for their real wages to decrease. So the level of minimum wage to decrease, I don't think that would ever fly. But
no.
Say the government are increasing the minimum wage by £1, but it could still mean that people's nominal wages are going down because the inflation rate is so high that even though the minimum wage has been adjusted or it has gone up, it might still not be at the level that it's been adjusted for inflation. So people's actual like nominal wages might actually be decreasing. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Regardless of if the minimum wage is being higher, and then there's the issue of you need to protect your minimum wage entry level workers, because the people who are kind of in the higher paying jobs aren't going to be really affected by the inflation nearly as much as the lower paid workers are going to be. So
that's again a problem posed, because we have the big corporations, as Oliver's mentioned, you mentioned, which again will pay more than your smaller businesses, and they can afford to pay more because they have greater profits, they have greater revenue, and they can put that expenditure out. We see Amazon in the States, they lobby actually, they say they're happy with more regulation, they want the regulation because you think why would a company want regulation?
Well, see,
because it puts their competitors out of business.
Exactly.
If
you can think either. Well, maybe you say they're advocating for this. I think they have a minimum wage of $15 in the US or something.
Yeah.
They have their own implemented minimum wage within the company. So if they are kind of they're advocates for like a federal minimum wage. I think if I'm correct, I think so.
Yes.
But one can kind of say, from a more cynical perspective, is it perhaps because it puts them at an advantage because Amazon, as such a large corporation, have the revenue to be able to deal with that increase in minimum wage, and it does put their competitors potentially out of business or low business. But another thing as well with minimum wages, it could it put younger workers, like you said, and more unexperienced workers at risk, but also the actual, if you think about minimum wage jobs, right? A lot of people who work in minimum wage jobs are teenagers, people our age, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and they will inevitably still be receiving, well, most of the time will still be receiving funding from their family, will not yet be financially sufficient. Not always, but in most cases, on the island anyway. So if you think about the proportion of young people in minimum wage jobs as opposed to kind of self-sufficient, financially independent people, adults, you can maybe see that this increase in minimum wage could actually flow up the income scale.
Yeah.
So although it's increasing the minimum wage for people, if it's say going to me, then it then benefits my family or potentially your family, or somebody could have a son in a job who gets a pay increase, but their dad could be earning 5 times the amount that the business owner is actually earning. So you could argue that it's a good increase for the minimum wage workers, but it does flow up higher up into the higher income
But we won't necessarily, if you're looking at young people, we won't necessarily do that, because if we're looking at maybe bigger corporations can afford to pay more, but lots of your smaller scale shops, lots of your smaller scale cafes, they can't necessarily, or businesses, they can't necessarily afford that giant increase in minimum wage, because again, the price of goods are rising, the price of costs, everything is rising. So is that minimum wage? It will just hit them more. It will hit their economy more. So they're more likely to go and say, well, you're a student. If they're looking at it from, because small businesses maybe work in a more, it's not so cutthroat as big corporates, where they're like, well, economically it's more viable to keep you and you. There may be more, well, Susan here has to support a family, but Bob here is just a student. Well, if we let Susan go, we might see Susan's 2 children suffer. So we're more likely to keep Susan than we would keep Bob, because Bob could maybe, in air quotes, afford to be let go. So again, Bob might not, but this method I don't think necessarily works for smaller businesses. So I suppose another point we could pose would be: is it better to have different bands of minimum wage according to business income?
Well, interesting. You've just hopped onto bands there. From an Isle of Man point of view, Laurie Hooper has recently just given his view on the matter, and he said that they were inappropriate, these bans, and that the assumption that age equates to experience was fundamentally flawed. An employee that has been with you for 2 years, aged 16 to 17, clearly has more experience than a brand new employee aged 18, and I completely agree with him. But
what happens if that new employee aged 18, because if you look at the stats, that new employee might just be newly employed by the business, has another 2 years of experience from 17 to 18 working in another business?
But I think what he's talking about there is someone that hasn't had that experience.
But then that company might just choose to hire the 16-year-old to 17-year-old who's had 2 years experience.
Yeah.
I don't.
But
they could choose to pay them more.
So it's a company. So someone that's 16 and 17 has been working for this company for 2 years. This 18-year-old hops in, who has probably a lot less responsibilities than this 16, 17-year-old, because they're not as experienced, so they're probably not as.
But what job are we in this example?
Okay, let's talk about a waiter. So, for example, this 16, 17-year-old is I don't know, he's assistant to the head waiter or whatever at this local bar and restaurant, or he could be assistant bartender or whatever, or he's on the cashier, for example. Cashier, he's probably got he needs to probably have a lot more responsibility. Then this 18-year-old hops in. They've had no experience whatsoever, and they're going to be getting paid the minimum wage for their age.
Yep.
Is it right that this 18-year-old that's got no experience isn't, so he's not great at his job? He's starting off.
How do you know he's not great at his job?
Well, no. See, this isn't a hypothetical situation, and this is a very real situation.
So he's saying he's not great at his job.
Because he's brand new.
He hasn't had the experience.
We're working for a top-class restaurant here. You know, we're talking for
Michelin star.
You know, we're talking about somewhere where the service. This person's not very good at customer service skills. I don't know how.
I think one of those restaurants, I'm pretty sure that the person 16 to 17, if they're in assistant manager or assistant head waiters, you put in your caveat
there.
The
weekends.
That they will be paid.
No, but that's the thing. Fair. That's the whole thing. This is a very real situation, because I actually have worked in several jobs over the years, and this is very real, where a fully trained 16, 17-year-old will be getting paid less than somebody who's just starting off, who is 18 or above. So the kind of the highest pay that you can achieve as a 16 or 17-year-old is still less than the entry level for an 18-plus-year-old. And the question he's asking, is that right? Is it not right?
And Laurie is suggesting that a lot of 16, 17-year-olds in their job are sometimes a lot more hardworking than that 18-year-old.
100%, yeah.
Because, sometimes, especially with them being on the minimum wage, they want to show their boss, look what I'm capable of. I should be up there.
But is that a case of age discrimination, would you say? I'm posing a question back to you.
Well, it's minimum wage. That's just how the minimum wage is.
That's how the bands are, and I'm not too much of a fan. I mean, that's I'm not really going to comment much more on that.
Yeah, the reason that I completely agree with you on that point. Actually, I don't think that that's the way it should be. But the reason that the minimum wage is lower for under 18-year-olds is because otherwise, if everyone was paid the same, none of them would be getting hired. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? The reason is to create demand for
Yeah.
these 18-year-olds.
And I suppose they don't want
under
I suppose
18-year-olds.
they don't want I suppose they don't want everyone in jobs, do they? Really, they don't want all the youth in jobs, do they? I suppose.
Well, but
Controversial,
but-
Ollie.
but-
Well, I'm just saying.
even though I just put another question to you on this. So you're saying it's maybe to increase the amount of 16, 17-year-olds getting hired and maybe get
Yeah.
experience. So surely that's a benefit to having the bans lower. So you'd support the bans being lower if it hires more 17 to 18-year-olds. Or
Yeah,
would you want
there's-
less 17 or 18-year-olds in work?
I think that in terms of kind of, it's, if you think about it, it's a little bit of a supply side kind of subsidy, if you wanna call it that, and to have the minimum wage lower for kind of younger people, it does encourage businesses to hire them. And we know in today's working world, it is very experience oriented rather than kind of what accolades you have to show. It is a lot more on experience, and it's evolving more so towards that direction. So but then there's a very fine line between kind of, there's this side of it, but then it's also, if you look at some of these developing countries who have minimum wages very, very, very much lower than kind of, I don't know, the G7 economies per se.
We also have a lower cost of living, so...
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's a very,
This is
it's
the
a
thing,
lower
a lot
standard
of it,
of
a lot
living.
of it is proportionate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it depends what country you point to, I suppose.
So is it, I suppose sort of, is there anything further you have to add?
Well, I have another point. I have my point.
You're going to get the last say, are you?
No, I come back. I have my point on this. So I think we've looked at it. I think it is reasonable to say that would be unreasonable for a 16, 17-year-old who has more experience than an 18-year-old getting paid less. I'd say that is the case there. And I think that would be wrong. But if we turn it into, we got rid of the minimum wage, that would get rid of the bans. That would get rid of this issue and be paying based on experience. You'd have a company and you'd hire the person with the most experience, surely. Because it's no incentive to hire 16 and 17-year-olds versus an 18-year-old. The company usually wants to hire the best person for a job. If you have a 25-year-old who's done XYZ amount of stuff versus a 45-year-old, you don't say, I'll hire the 45-year-old.
Some workers may want to take on, especially in sort of the hospitality industry, you don't need to be qualified really at all. Apart from if you're going to be, I don't know,
so they're more likely, I think,
to take the minimum wage workers, because
no, but let's say minimum wage didn't exist.
Yeah.
And you got, so I'm a hiring person. So I've got an 18-year-old here with no experience. I've got a 16. I've got a set. No, it has to be the other way. I've got a 19-year-old here with no experience, and I've got a 17-year-old here. Well, it's an 18-year-old here with no experience, and a 17-and-a-half-year-old with a year and a half of experience working. I would surely, and you could pay both of them the same because there'd be no bans. You wouldn't have an incentive to hire the 17-year-old. You would surely go and pay the 17-and-a-half-year-old more money.
The issue...
Wouldn't
okay,
you?
so
As a business.
Yeah. You would,
Yeah.
yeah. But first off, it's like that 17-and-a-half-year-old, say they had no years of experience, you'd hire the 18-year-olds, and then how would the 17-and-a-half-year-old get the year and a half of experience if you're paying everybody the same? Do you know what I'm saying?
So which side would you fall on? Do you want to keep the bans?
Well,
or would you
I
get rid
think
of
that,
the bans?
listen, if you get rid of bans, that leaves a huge opportunity for employers to exploit their workers. And if you look at kind of, in terms of economic growth, minimum wage can actually also benefit economic growth because it provides that incentive for the workers to go out and work. For example, so you have to incentivize people, otherwise they kind of fall back on maybe the government welfare schemes, or they'd prefer not to go out and work for 30p an hour. If we remove these minimum wage brackets, it's all well and good in terms of the supply and demand diagrams and looking at the economy as a whole, but at the end of the day, if you look at an individual person, then that's a whole nother story. You can't kind of convert people into statistics in this case, I don't think, because there are so many kind of wide varieties of influences on economic growth that...
If you can't convert people into statistics in this case, where do we go and look at the... I think it's an interesting point. If we can't convert people into statistics, this is a philosophical issue on it. Can we convert people into statistics? Should we be looking just at the statistics? But if we can't convert people with statistics, how can then we look at either keeping the minimum wage? How can we justify keeping the minimum wage, getting rid of the minimum wage, or anything on it? Because otherwise we're left with the issue where we can't deal on these by that means we couldn't necessarily in large policies. And I point to an interesting example, maybe a more extreme example, of China's iron rice bowl, which it had under Mao, where people would get a guaranteed wage at their job and they didn't really have to work. It wasn't incentivized. Then we saw Deng go and scrap the iron roll based policy. They introduced maybe more incentivized working. So the harder you work, basically, the more you earned. It was more target led in that sense. And it then sped up their economic growth. People were pulled out of poverty. They didn't like at first having the iron rice bowl pulled away, but I argue that sort of thing. If people shouldn't need if they have the incentive to work hard, they will work hard, and they will usually go far. And in most cases, it does work. But again, I come back to how do we manage if we can't convert people into statistics?
I don't think that we should abolish the minimum wage. I don't think that abolishing it would do any good to our kind of economy or our society at all. First of all, can you imagine the uproar, the social uproar that would come with abolishing a minimum wage? But
there was social uproar with saying that the road was round, not flat. Is it a bad thing to do?
No, I mean that's a whole nother again.
But it's a bad thing to like convert people into statistics to deal with economics, or maybe have social change, because are these necessarily bad things to implement? Is that what should restrict us from doing a policy that's right?
I don't. That's another good point you pose. But at the end of the day, I think there is a way for the government to, if they wanted to kind of keep the minimum wage at its minimum, essentially, that they could just allow it to stay where it is and allow inflation to go up and not adjust it at all. So if inflation goes up by 5%, minimum wage stays the same. That's 5% less of nominal wages that people are receiving. So, but at the same time, I really think that this whole exploitation of workers thing is a really overreaching point, because can you imagine the amount of employers that are going to pay kind of people 30p an hour, 2p an hour for such hard work? And eventually people aren't going to want to work, and we're going to have a shortage of labour.
You've got to set a benchmark.
But then
you've got to have incentives.
At some point, this is where it comes into which side of the economic sphere you sit on. Because I argue the market would pick that up. Because the market would say, well, if people aren't wanting to work for 30p, well, someone out there will... Actually, there are people who would work for X, Y, Z amount. But there's other people who say, well, we'll pick your job. We'll pick... The offers will go up, and I think the market will balance itself out. We just don't... The thing is, we're too... Almost... We focus too much on making everyone happy, or how they think they should be happy. Because we're not... we're almost societally told this is how it should be, this is how it is, this is how it will be, and this is how things are kept as they are. But no one really there. We should question these things and say, is it really the right policy? And I can't see the arguments you've put forward. We've looked at maybe the banding gaps of minimum wage, and I'm persuaded by your argument that banding gaps aren't right. But then if we remove the banding gaps, we face the other issue that maybe 16 to 17s won't be hired. So then we get rid of that issue. So that issue is either it's bad to have it, but it's also bad to get rid of it.
And I suppose it's that sort of factor in life that 16, 17-year-olds can't just expect to go to experience high pay. You know,
you have to work
from somewhere. You have to somehow be at a lower wage. So I think it's now a good time to conclude. We've had quite a lengthy discussion on this debate.
I have one more point.
You want more point? Yeah, okay, another point. Yeah, another point.
But even if we look at inflation with cost of living necessarily to look at, if we look at maybe 1959, and this is again a US example of the cost of living with cost of appliances, the thing is we need to remember the cost of lots of things has actually gone down because they've gone more mass market with stuff. And before, in 1959, this is comparing to 2013, so slightly out of date, but it's an interesting example. We have household appliances of a washing machine, a clothes, a tumble dryer in our case, a dishwasher, a refrigerator, a freezer, a hob, a coffee pot, a blender, a toaster, a vacuum cleaner, a colour TV. That all comes up to 1,851 at that retail price. And to guess it, you'd have to work at the minimum wage about 885 hours. In modern terms, it would come to a total of 3,289, which may seem like more increase at first. But to get the same goods to work at the same cost, you would need to I think it's working on medium wage, you'd need to actually only work 170.4 hours. So, again, it's minimum wage. We say this hasn't risen with inflation, how we're worse off than we were, but the studies show, I think we actually see we're more beneficial in certain ways. And yes, we do spend more on certain things. As the person with about housing, I think, said, well, if we didn't have a Netflix subscription, we stopped eating the avocado toast to be able to afford a house, which is really ridiculous because it doesn't actually cost that much for avocado and toast, and Netflix, not housing. But if we're looking even at examples where maybe we are better off, I can't see the arguments again for keeping the minimum wage in lines with inflation with all of this, because, or even with bans, I don't see the arguments. I think it is heavily flawed as a minimum wage. There's a question. Not just should we abolish it, but it needs to be looked at.
See, your example there, it's all relative to standard of living though, isn't it? It's all very well and good to say that, yeah, you work less hours compared to 1959, but standard of living is much higher than in 1959, you could argue.
Relative poverty is lower. Absolute
So
poverty
why
is
would you
lower.
why would you not want to continue to kind of increase the standard of living, decrease the level of poverty?
But that's done with technological advances.
Is it though?
It is. Because if you think about it, when the car, let's say when the motor car first came out, it was so unachievable to the general populace because it cost such a ridiculous amount. It wasn't achievable. Now, it's much more accessible. Even its smartphone, for example, the laptop, the computer, all of these have gone down because the market has played its role. And the market has said, well, look, we can produce more of these, we can make more of these, and the price goes down. I think the market ultimately does a better job at controlling than government, because the market the government tries to predict what the market would do and what things will happen and the trends which happen. And the market isn't necessarily that predictable item. We see in the case of Hong Kong with, it's not Copperwaite, I've forgotten the name of the financial secretary in the 60s. And he very much stood off the statistics, said we're not measuring our GDP capacity, our gross national income, we're not adding this government regulation, and we're not having all of this regulation companies. And it grew astronomically. The poverty lines massively decreased, the companies grew, it became a world financial hub and really a place to imagine. It's almost like it is market capitalism, because he slept with a copy of Adam Smith under his pillow, and that's apparently what he did. So it is almost this idea, if we do follow Smith's economics, we do lead to prosperity. And that's an example which has been done and is tangible. It's not just a hypothetical.
It's the Hayek versus Keynes argument, isn't it?
It is, of course.
It's another question you pose there is, where do you reach your point of diminishing marginal utility? Where does that come, and will it come in? And then another one is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, can be massively manipulated depending on the basket of goods used within it. So it's kind of like, it really depends, because obviously it's a weighted basket of goods, usually fuel, housing, essentials such as clothes and food. You can weight them differently. If fuel is massively inflating, as we know it currently is, you can take that out of the CPI and inflation rates are suddenly very much lower. So that's a whole nother thing that could come into play in terms of kind of fluctuating minimum wages is.
But I think the statistics, are actually the issue as well, because
Do you think?
we're focused too much. Inflation's done this has done this has done this. But with the guiding policies are being too much influenced. It's almost, the government has one policy, it thinks it will work. Maybe it will work in 5 years, but the inflation does this. And inflation is, I'm waving my hands here, the inflation doesn't follow what the government thought it did. So it adjusts its policy to a different thing, which then might work, but they keep on adjusting it so much, we never actually have time to see if policies do work, because they're not left for long enough to kind of mature. It's almost like you have some port and you put it in a barrel, and then 5 years later you drink it. And in 10 years maybe it's better because it's more flavour. You prefer a stronger port. We are taking it out 2 seconds after it's gone in. What's the point? What's the point of influencing
You're
policy?
here articulating a very neoclassical Thatcherite kind of vision of economics.
Possibly I am. Yes.
I think so.
I am a
And-
Thatcherite, so
Yeah, well, and I honestly that is a good point. I think that the price mechanism will definitely work, and I think in the pandemic, especially in the wake of the pandemic, I do agree that government policy has been kind of very up and down.
Flip-flopping,
Yeah,
as I
can
say.
you blame them? But at the same time, it's like the market fails. The market does fail, and even kind of Smith recognised that market failure does occur in the form of public goods, in the form of demerit goods.
Yes.
Yeah, so you do need some level of government intervention. The question is, would we class exploitation of workers as market failure? Because I personally would class that as market failure. If you look at all these developing countries, I'd class that as market failure, and I'd argue that there is a need there for government intervention. Then the next question we pose, because I personally don't believe in abolishing it completely at all.
Well, is it flawed is the question.
Is it flawed? As in, that's a very broad question, though. It's a very kind of open-ended question. What about it is flawed? I think that it potentially does need to be adjusted in terms of nominal versus real wages, and it does need to be adjusted
to be increased, maybe?
According to fluctuating inflation. If inflation is this high, but then again, the statistics can be manipulated. The CPI, again, not even manipulated. That's just the nature of the CPI. The basket of goods changes year on year.
It's impossible to really have a consistent approach to it. And again, we point to exploitation of workers and the market maybe doing that. But if we look at countries which are dictatorships, which are heavy government intervention, because government controls everything, maybe like the Soviet Union, we see China, originally as it was, now it's gone more capitalist, almost a new form of capitalism, state capitalism. And then we see maybe North Korea as another example. We can almost choose any state control, and generally they exploit their workers more, I think. I think the workers are worse off, and the market has lifted those out of poverty.
Would you say that was the market that did that? I don't think under a command economy, do you really think that the market is the one determining the outcomes?
When it's replaced by a market, I think the market does a much better job than the government does at actually giving people. It gives the people the opportunity to thrive, and it stops us being controlled by the likes of the large corporations like Amazon saying, let's have more regulation here, or McDonald's saying, let's increase the minimum wage because we can afford to pay our workers more, but we know.
But that is the epitome of the epitome of kind of the very, very extreme free market, though. So what you're saying is that in this command market, these workers are being exploited, and this free market, this very extreme radical free market with no government intervention, is lifting them out of it. But then in the same breath you're saying that these large corporations are also exploiting their workers. So if you look at both ends of the spectrum, it's not really a spectrum, it's more of a circle that comes back to the same point.
Well, of course it's a circle, but I think if we look at the market as a whole, I think it does a better job at stopping large corporations forming, in a way, unless we obviously have the government controlling and they really limit large corporations.
You think the free market stops large corporations from forming?
I think it does a better job because it reduces regulation, and I think regulation has allowed companies which already exist and have power to continue, because it's almost who gets in the right side of the regulation. Those who thrive under regulation do well, and those who are harmed by it don't do well. And then usually companies which do well under it have stronger lobbying, and they almost persuading the politicians who are going at it, yes, that's the right decision to go and introduce this regulation.
Well, I think
was Oliver stopping any debate.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have covered the subject very well.
He's fed up with economics.
Perhaps an economics week where I don't partake.
No, you're a pivotal part of the debate.
Would be.
Well, we did have to cut Oliver's minimum wage to zilch. So,
yes. Well,
you did. I am not in favour of cutting it to zilch.
Oh, sorry. No, we can't cut his minimum wage to zilch because here at PolitiBabble the minimum wage doesn't exist.
Yes. Anyway,
for Oliver only.
Shall we move on to our current affairs quickly of the week, Archie, if that's okay?
Yes.
If you could play our.
We didn't get any actual guests from our listeners this week, apart from being tagged in a congratulations, we won a free iPhone 13, which I think we've actually earned a lot of iPhone 13s over the past few weeks.
We have.
So Oliver and I are rolling in with iPhone, or rather I am rolling in with iPhone 13s.
Yes.
And I'm obviously using Apple. Yes.
You guys didn't prepare me for this section as well. What's this current affairs?
I should have really briefed you on.
Yeah.
I thought you knew how the episodes work, Mika.
Are you not a regular listener?
I am. I listen religiously every single morning.
So
I
she already
replay the old
knows.
episodes.
Yes. If you don't listen to PolitiBabble 24/7, what are you doing? Do write into us at politibabble@gmail.com or on any of our social media at PolitiBabble.
Or on paper to Manx Radio Broadcasting House.
Do send a letter. Would you like letters? Yes.
Anyway, if we could have the news theme, please, Archie.
Joke's on you, it was already obviously playing.
Oh, was it? Anyway, storms have battered the island this week, with Storm Franklin being the latest one, and I think another one to come later on in the week. I'm not sure, something beginning with G, Geraldine or something. I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, the government has said that the economic recovery lies firmly resting on the shoulders of businesses now, as they've cut support to them following post-COVID. Russian MHK says Tynwald should expect consultation, as he believes the Department of Infrastructure has gone against the will of Tynwald, and that's in regards to
Never does that.
The sea terminal. So just a quick roundup of this week's current affairs.
You forgot with the huge potential for IOM in the medicinal cannabis.
Oh,
industry,
yes,
apparently. The Peel Group.
Yes.
And another current affair, the DOI's post regarding Storm Eunice.
Oh yeah, so we're getting too many topics here. I'm afraid it's gonna be.
You can take your pick and filter out the most relevant ones.
Well, we'll probably.
I think we've picked the two relevant ones, so.
Yeah. No, you can't do that. we'll take the Mika's ones first handly. I think the comment was. I mean, it's probably
hilarious. It's brilliant. Well, it wasn't not funny. You have to admit, it probably made you laugh.
From the Department of Infrastructure, though?
Did it make you laugh?
Not really.
Not really.
No.
Interesting.
For many people on social media, I'm not expressing my view here, being the diplomatic one for once, as
he always is.
As always is.
Yeah.
But from the views that I've witnessed on social media, many people did find it funny. And
what was the joke, Oliver?
It was.
Yeah, Oliver, what was the joke?
What's the joke?
If people would like me to read it out, I can do.
Just so I can get a clip of
It's
Oliver.
it's quite hypocritical of
I'm not going to say it then.
of Jeff the Mongoose.
I'll say
no,
it.
listen,
Yeah.
because this news outlet. I don't know if I'm.
No, say it.
No,
say it. We are. We are.
It's an online platform. We can't be regulated.
And
It's
we're
fine.
independently produced.
I've already said the name of
Yeah,
the
too late.
of the
That
media outlet,
company.
but the media outlet
I like Jeff,
reposted the
but,
post. Yeah, I do as well, but they reposted it without saying anything, and then only put up their kind of take on it. Once backlash started flooding in,
And
so
then they deleted their
Did
original
they?
post,
I didn't know that.
like the DOI did.
Yeah. Well, who knows?
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm
they did
also-
brand it.
I'm gonna take your stance of diplomacy here and not comment on that one extensively, but
Oh well, I'll give a comment on it.
Go on, then.
I'll read out the comment as well. Well, I'm just getting to it because Jeff Mongoose posts too much. Let me find it. I think I posted it on my story and said ridiculous or something.
Well, anyway.
Woke. Yes. I say woke's gone mad on it. Because you actually look at it, the comment was, "Thank you for your patience and understanding, but like most women, Eunice changes her mind what she's doing." You can tell, obviously, the grammatical mistake was awful there because she said no apostrophe. That's what really did make me annoyed at the post.
unforgivable.
That's what made me annoyed at the post. But Jeff Mongoose said, "Hey, do I fancy spending less time being sexist on Facebook and perhaps more time working on the prom?" I thought this was something else, or maybe fixing some potholes. I just don't. There's many people on social media, women included. And actually, the majority of people posting were middle-aged women, actually, not called Karen, who said they quite liked the humour. Obviously, it hit Daily Mail headlines, which is something quite rare for the island. But it only seems DOI hits the Daily Mail headlines, as we got the last thing from the island, I think, was the Roundel hit the DOI headlines.
Yeah, it hit a lot of international news.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll just touch on one more very quickly before we move on.
Oliver's doesn't like the woke brigade.
Economic recovery firmly resting on the shoulders of businesses. There is a time when the government are going to have to pull the plug on their support to businesses. It can't carry on. They've had a huge amount of support, really, over the past 2 years. I mean, not a great deal, but quite a considerable amount. I know that the businesses have lost a lot of money, but we do have to move on at some point. So yeah, it must be scary as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, to think, right, I have got to get on with it now.
But how would they survive pre-COVID? we don't have lockdowns now. We're going on the outbound of COVID. How they have
It's
to
their
learn.
job.
As a business, they are supposed to make money themselves. They're not supposed to be propped up by government to make money. That's not their job. Considering we have zero corporation tax as well, they're not supposed to be propped up by government. The government doesn't earn anything really.
In the budget, I don't know if you were listening to the budget thing that they unveiled, where they said, "Is the 10-0 rule outdated?"
Yes.
This kind of corporation.
I don't
thing.
believe it is, because it provides a lot. I think it provides a large. It almost gives us a hub for entrepreneurialism. If we apparently I've got an alarm.
It's Archie's bedtime, everyone.
Yes, I'm off now.
Too much politics for today.
Yes, no, but I think almost if we play it right, and if the Department of Enterprise did its job right, we'd be a hub. Not that it's not doing its job right. I'm not commenting on that. It would be a hub for entrepreneurialism, because we have that unique ability where we're not charging these corporations tax. We're not hampering their profits and anything they earn in the initial stage. We even have an entrepreneurial grant. It makes us, I think, very, very attractive for businesses.
100%, 100% it does. Question is, what kind of industries are the government now looking at attracting to the island? And then in terms of small business support as well, it's not their job is to make money and to not be propped up by the government, but ultimately these government regulations, small businesses, entrepreneurialism, innovation is such a big part of kind of long run of the macroeconomy's growth that to kind of expect them to stay afloat is a very big ask. Again, the question is, when do you draw the line of kind of cutting that support off? But then is, I guess, the same question of, when do we draw the line of COVID restrictions? When do we kind of move past this pandemic?
Well, they're going on the 31st.
Yeah.
But with you say, where should we draw the line? I think we should already drawn the line, because the key point is, if let's say you work for 2 years and someone works for 2 years and you keep, let's say it's Pamela. I'm creating names here. I create wonderful names. Pamela here. It's Susan and Bob earlier, but Pamela here. And the government, someone subsidises her £1,000 each month, because they're saying, I don't know how much, it may not be relative, it's subsidise her £1,000 each month. She then learns to rely on that £1,000. She does her budgeting as if she had £1,000. Once you take that £1,000 away, she's not going to like you taking £1,000 away. She'll struggle probably the next month, because she's not used, she has to adjust her budget. The sooner you do that rather than later, the better the company will be, because they're not having that long-term dependency on it. Even if you look at it, it's almost like an addiction to this government subsidy. I think it's dangerous.
Increase in productivity and
we can see
but
that company may, if it will fail, and if it survives, and that's business.
But then apply that to us. We have had our exams cancelled, or we've had like kind of supplementary information in terms of our exams. I personally wouldn't be a fan of kind of being left afloat, saying you're still taking your GCSEs as they were, you're still taking your A levels.
Well, it's because we had education adversely affected. We had a year, i.e. last year, or at least your GCSEs, where it was adversely affected by COVID. But the years coming in after us won't have had their education affected to the same degree.
Well then, education. That's the
so
question.
You should draw the line.
Yeah, so
I think you should draw that.
Going into an education debate.
But once they're not, it's drawing the line. I think we've come out of the pandemic. We've had a year or so now without the restrictions. I think now's the time definitely to end this level of support. Or we should maybe if they wanted to, maybe be kinder, wean them off. Almost the support.
Yeah, it's opportunity cost, isn't it? It's Boris's favourite line is, we've become the biggest economy in the G7 recently.
Yes, I wonder why, because we pay a lot. We have a ridiculous deficit.
But
bring back Thatcher.
Again,
that's what
opportunity cost. Yes. It's all relative.
Bring back Thatcher and the world will be set straight, I think.
Anywho, I...
Oh, we do. We have international news this
yes,
week.
Okay,
yes.
Yeah.
We have the interesting. I wonder what's happening in Eastern Europe. Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of tension there.
What's our bets? We might get hacked by the Russians for saying this, but what's our bets?
I personally will again be taking a stance of diplomacy here and not be hedging any bets on the situation. I'm just kind
of... I'm going to be a little bit more than that. I think Putin's he's looking a bit risky.
Doing the wrong
moment.
thing.
He's doing the wrong thing, definitely. But not that I feel like it's the right thing at all. I completely think it's not acceptable. But
Well, he's
it looks
recognised
like
the
he is,
breakaway regions of Ukraine.
Yeah, he looks like he's going to be.
I think he's just miffed
Yeah.
that he didn't manage to get his hands on the Western
Miffed.
leaders' DNA. Because all of them, when they met with him, he said he wouldn't meet with them in distance if they hadn't taken the Russian PCR test. And they didn't want to take the Russian PCR test because they didn't want their DNA being to Russians.
Yeah.
So they basically had to set a really long tail with him. I think Putin was just a bit miffed he couldn't develop some secret weapon for
It's an
using
eloquent and articulate
Yes.
verb there.
I
Miffed.
do like miffed. It's a rather good word. But yeah, so there we go. I think it's dangerous. I think it's interesting what's going to happen, and hopefully nothing does happen. But Boris, there's been talk that he won't. He argues he shouldn't resign in the middle of a national crisis. But I think there's been precedent in the past for leaders resigning in national crisis to make way for a better leader. We saw Neville Chamberlain be forced out before World War II, and we saw Churchill, excellent as he was, rise to that post. We've seen many crises. Even we saw. I think before the economic crisis hit the UK, Thatcher was forced out. We've seen all of these different things where prime ministers can leave in the middle of a crisis. There's nothing wrong with that. They're not dealing with it well, and Boris, I think it's time to go. So that's, again, something
I think
interesting.
the only way he'll go is a vote of no confidence. I don't think he'll...
No, he won't resign. He's far
No,
too...
Pompous.
Pompous, yeah. Well,
Nice one.
even though, if you think about it, if he was pompous, he would resign out of a matter of principle because he'd be a principled man, and he'd be very much, this is the right thing to do, and I'm doing the right thing for the.
Yeah.
But he's just a bit of a politician. as we
Opens up
say.
the whole other constitution crisis, constitutional
Yeah,
crisis
I mean,
debate, doesn't it?
We could probably have it 1 week. We'll probably do a Boris week.
We've done enough Boris weeks. I
Well, we
think.
have.
So
I know, but
far,
Boris.
We've done a lot of Boris weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You never know. You might
um,
not get the opportunity to do another one in the future.
Yeah.
Oh, we
depending
can.
on
Yes.
how things go.
We'll just be talking about the vegan sausage rolls and the
Yes,
beautiful
yeah.
blue new
What is
passports.
this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The point of the week.
Did you like? Yeah, here the vegan sausage rolls. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And the vegan cake,
With Nick
which
Ferrari.
yes.
But yes.
Does a vegan cake work?
Pardon?
Yeah,
I don't know.
I have had a
In my
vegan
experience,
chocolate
it's
cake.
not worked.
Yeah, they sell them at
It's
my work.
Yeah.
Jaffa cake.
Jaffa cake.
Well, no, I've not getting. Are they cake? Oh, that's a
I
different
think
issue.
we've had this before on the
But anyway,
podcast.
we should move on to our final segment of the week, where we get Mika to talk about a topic.
For 1 minute.
For
1
1
minute
minute.
waffle.
What's it about? What was it about now? What was it?
It was about price of coffee.
Price of coffee.
Price of coffee. There. Oh, is it off?
I'm not sure if
off we
I'm
go.
really up to standard here, guys.
Oh,
It's a
go
lot
for
of
it.
pressure.
I've talked waffle on here before.
You'll be better
many
than
a
Oliver.
time.
Is it like a discussion or is
No,
it
it's
like
you.
one?
It's
We can discuss it after. But you,
Yeah. Go.
Go ahead.
Okay, so today I'll be discussing the prices of coffee on my 1 minute waffle, which I'm assuming that I'm being timed on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So, personally, I think that this ties really well into our kind of minimum wage debate that we've just had. And I'd just like to articulate that prices of coffee 100% are rising. And the real debate, the real economic debate is, are they inferior goods or not? In terms of,
Inferior to tea.
well, that's not the type of inferior
Wow,
good I was
interruption.
talking about. But do they go up as income goes up, or does the demand for them go down as income goes up? Is the real question. So, because obviously inflation has gone up because the CPI, all of this recent pandemic issues gone on, the price of coffee has obviously increased by like a fair amount. Does it affect the kind of the lower earning bracket more so than it does the higher earning bracket? Is it now potentially is the demand curve shifting inwards because there are substitutes, i.e. supermarket brand coffee, instant coffee? The real question is, do you go for that increase in the price for your handcrafted coffee from these maybe large corporations, from these small businesses, or do you settle for your supermarket brand coffee? Or some people may even think that the quality of the supermarket brand is better.
Perfect. Well, bang on time as
Yeah,
well.
Excellent.
But with
That was quite
do
difficult,
you
you
remember, as Christy Alsop says, if you stop buying your coffee and stop buying your Netflix subscription, you can afford a house.
Well, personally, I'm not a great coffee fan at all. I like coffee cake. I like sort of.
You're on the
coffee-
wrong
Really?
programme.
coffee-
No, I'm
Yeah,
not a fan of.
I
I'm
like
not a
coffee
fan of
flavoured
even the
stuff.
flavour.
You don't like
I
coffee
don't
either?
I like the
coffee, no.
flavourings and stuff, but I don't.
quite
like
ironic,
coffee.
We
isn't
got
it?
you arguing in
Uh,
favour of coffee.
No, it's a bit
yeah.
ironic considering I work
Yeah,
at a
it's no-
coffee shop.
Yeah,
A
tea
cafe.
is better. on the whole.
I like tea. Yeah, herbal teas as well.
I don't know. I'm not really.
Earl Grey.
Yeah. Tea.
Earl Grey, of course.
This podcast
Wouldn't
supports
expect
tea.
any.
Yes, it certainly does. Yorkshire
Yes,
tea
yeah.
all the way. I love my Yorkshire tea.
Impartial to a hot chocolate myself.
Very
Yeah.
common.
Nice little hot chocolate.
Anyway, yes, that concludes our wonderful episode. Thank you very much for coming on. Yes.
Thanks for
Hope
having
you've
me.
enjoyed it. If not, well, you know. You've enjoyed it, because
I have.
that's going to be our final conclusion. Yes, that's, you know, we should all drink some tea. Go drink some tea if you haven't already today. So yes, that concludes our wonderful episode of this week's PolitiBabble with our brilliant guest, Mika Chen. And we'll be back next week without my alarm, hopefully, for a discussion on, what was it, Oliver, next week?
Can't remember. I'm not going to confirm at the moment, but
Well, we don't know. Something
interesting.
will be on next week. I haven't looked at the spreadsheet yet. So if you do want to come on PolitiBabble, or do you want to have a topic discussed or anything of the sort, you can contact us at PolitiBabble or write into us at politibabble@gmail.com if you want to listen to the back episodes of the PolitiBabble podcast, because obviously you must listen to them 24/7. You can head over to maxradio.com/podcast/PolitiBabble. PolitiBabble spelled PolitiPabble.
Thank you for joining us, Mika. You've been PolitiBabble.
Thanks for having me.
Cheerio.
There we go.